Peter's lesson: faith must be proven in the fire, not in comfort. Faith is one of the most spoken words in Christianity, yet one of the least understood. Many profess it with their lips, many admire it in others, and many believe they possess it, until life begins to apply pressure. The Apostle Peter understood this tension better than most. He walked with Jesus, witnessed miracles firsthand, heard divine truth directly from the mouth of the Son of God, and yet discovered, painfully and publicly, that faith spoken in comfort is not the same as faith proven in fire. Peter's life stands as a living warning and a powerful lesson. Genuine faith is not validated in moments of safety, applause, or spiritual excitement. It is tested in fear, loss, opposition, and suffering. Faith reveals its true nature only when comfort is removed. This is why Peter later wrote with such authority about trials, suffering, endurance, and refinement. He was not repeating religious ideas, he was speaking from experience. Modern believers often misunderstand faith as emotional confidence, positive thinking, or verbal declaration. Peter teaches something far deeper. Faith is allegiance under pressure. Faith is obedience when obedience costs you something. Faith is standing firm when standing firm isolates you, threatens you, or breaks your heart. Faith is not proven when following Christ benefits you. It is proven when following Christ costs you. This lesson matters now more than ever. Many walk with God while life is peaceful, but few remain when faith demands sacrifice. Peter's journey exposes the uncomfortable truth. Untested faith is unproven faith, and unproven faith cannot sustain you when the fire comes. This teaching is not meant to condemn, but to awaken. Peter failed before he became strong. He collapsed before he became steady. His story is not about shame, it is about transformation. It reveals how God uses fire not to destroy faith, but to refine it. If you want a faith that endures, a faith that stands when the world shakes, and a faith that does not collapse under pressure, you must understand Peter's lesson. Faith must be proven in the fire, not in comfort. Why faith in comfort is easy, but spiritually dangerous faith expressed in comfort is effortless. When life is stable, relationships are intact, finances are secure, health is strong, and opposition is minimal. Faith feels natural, prayers flow easily, worship feels uplifting, and obedience does not feel costly. In these seasons, it is easy to believe we are strong believers. Yet Peter's life reveals that comfort can deceive us about the true state of our faith. Before the fire, Peter was confident. He spoke boldly. He declared loyalty without hesitation. When Jesus warned that all would fall away, Peter responded with absolute certainty, insisting that even if everyone else failed, he would remain faithful. His words sounded sincere. His emotions were strong. His intentions were genuine. But his faith had never been tested under threat, fear, or personal loss. Comfort creates a false sense of spiritual maturity. It allows faith to exist without resistance. When nothing challenges belief, belief is never forced to deepen. Faith in comfort is often unexamined, untested, and unstrengthened. This does not mean comfort is evil, but it is dangerous when mistaken for proof of spiritual depth. Peter's confidence was rooted in emotion, not endurance. He loved Jesus deeply, but love alone had not yet been tested by fear. He believed in Christ, but belief had not yet been confronted by self-preservation. Comfort allowed Peter to assume that his passion equaled faithfulness. Fire would later reveal the difference. Spiritually, comfort can weaken vigilance. When life is calm, believers often relax their guard. Prayer becomes casual. Dependence on God becomes theoretical rather than desperate. The urgency to remain watchful fades. This is why Jesus warned Peter to stay awake and pray. Peter, surrounded by comfort and familiarity, slept instead. Faith that is never challenged often becomes fragile. It feels strong until pressure arrives. Then it collapses not because it was false, but because it was shallow. Peter did not lack sincerity. He lacked depth forged through suffering. Depth only develops when faith must choose between safety and obedience. Comfort also hides idols. When life is easy, we do not see what truly controls us. Fear remains dormant. Pride remains unexposed. The instinct for self-preservation lies hidden beneath good intentions. Peter did not know how much he valued safety until following Jesus became dangerous. Only then did fear rise to the surface and override conviction. This is why faith in comfort is spiritually dangerous. It convinces us that words are enough. It allows belief to remain theoretical. It prevents us from seeing the areas where faith has not yet reached. Comfort creates the illusion of strength, while fire reveals reality. God does not test faith to embarrass us, but to reveal what must be transformed. Peter's denial was not the end of his calling. It was the beginning of his refinement. The collapse of his confidence exposed where grace needed to rebuild him. Without that exposure, Peter would never have become the pillar he later was. Faith that has never faced loss does not know how to endure. Faith that has never been opposed does not know how to stand. Faith that has never been tested does not know its own limits. Comfort allows faith to remain unchallenged, but fire forces it to mature. Peter's lesson warns us not to confuse emotional certainty with spiritual strength. Faith that cannot survive pressure is not yet complete. God allows seasons of fire because only fire reveals whether faith is rooted in convenience or conviction. If your faith feels strong only when life is calm, it is not yet ready for responsibility. God prepares his servants through testing, not indulgence. Peter became a shepherd of suffering believers because he first learned obedience through failure and fire. Faith proven in comfort will collapse under pressure. Faith proven in fire will remain standing when everything else falls apart. If this message is strengthening your understanding of true faith and helping you grow spiritually, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next teaching in this series. Fire reveals what words can never prove. There is a profound difference between what a believer says and what a believer becomes when pressure is applied. Words are easy to form when there is no cost attached to them. Declarations flow freely when safety is guaranteed. Promises sound convincing when there is no threat demanding their fulfillment. This is why fire is essential. Fire strips away language and exposes reality. It reveals what words can never prove. Before the fire, Peter spoke with confidence. He declared loyalty without hesitation. He believed his own words because nothing had yet demanded proof. His identity as a disciple was intact, while the environment remained safe. But the moment the atmosphere shifted, when fear entered the room and danger became personal, his words collapsed. Fire did not create weakness in Peter. It exposed what already existed beneath the surface. This is the nature of spiritual testing. Trials do not destroy faith, they reveal it. Pressure does not manufacture fear, it exposes where fear already reigns. When fire comes, it does not ask what you believe in theory. It demands to know what you trust when obedience threatens your security. This is why Scripture repeatedly speaks of faith being tested like gold. Gold does not become gold through fire. Fire simply removes what is not gold. Peter's denial was not merely a moment of fear, it was a revelation of misplaced confidence. His trust was not yet anchored in God's sustaining grace, but in his own strength. He believed he could remain faithful through sheer determination. Fire exposed the limits of self-reliance. When the cost became real, the flesh took control and the spirit retreated. This pattern repeats throughout the life of every believer. Many walk confidently with God while obedience is convenient, but when faith demands loss, silence, rejection, or suffering, words begin to lose their power. Fire reveals whether faith is rooted in devotion or comfort, It separates admiration for Christ from submission to Christ. Fire also dismantles illusions. Peter believed proximity to Jesus guaranteed strength. He walked with him, learned from him, and witnessed his power. Yet proximity does not equal transformation. Knowledge does not equal obedience. Exposure to truth does not equal surrender to truth. Fire forces these distinctions into the open. It exposes the gap between what we know and what we live. In the courtyard where Peter denied Jesus, the fire burned visibly, warming the hands of those who stood around it. But another fire burned invisibly inside Peter. It was the fire of fear, self-preservation, and confusion. When questioned, his instinct was not faithfulness, but survival. Fire exposed which voice held authority in his heart. This is why faith must be proven, not proclaimed. God does not measure belief by enthusiasm, but by endurance. He does not assess devotion by language, but by obedience under pressure. Fire reveals who God is to you when trusting Him becomes dangerous. It exposes whether your faith depends on outcomes or on obedience alone. Peter's failure was devastating, but it was necessary. Without it, he would have remained dependent on his own strength. Without it, he would not have understood grace deeply enough to shepherd others. Fire humbled him, stripped him, and prepared him for restoration. The man who once boasted became the man who later strengthened suffering believers because he had been broken first. Fire also purifies motives. Before testing, faith is often mixed with pride, ambition, and self-image. Peter wanted to be strong, loyal, and courageous. But those desires were still centered on self. Fire shifted his focus. After restoration, Peter no longer spoke of his own strength. He spoke of God's power, God's grace, and God's sustaining presence in suffering. This is why God allows fire in the lives of those He intends to use. Untested faith cannot carry responsibility. Unrefined belief cannot withstand persecution. Fire removes what would eventually destroy faith if left untouched. It is not punishment, it is preparation. Faith proven in fire becomes unshakable because it no longer depends on circumstances. It no longer collapses when comfort disappears. It no longer needs applause to survive. It has learned that God remains faithful even when everything else is stripped away. Peter emerged from fire transformed. His voice carried weight because it was forged through failure and restoration. His faith endured because it was no longer rooted in confidence but in surrender. Fire did what words never could. It revealed truth, destroyed illusion, and produced genuine faith. If your faith is currently being tested, it is not a sign of abandonment. It is evidence of refinement. God is not exposing you to shame you, but to strengthen you. Fire is not your enemy. It is the instrument through which faith becomes real. If this teaching is helping you understand why trials are part of spiritual growth and how God refines true faith, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue this journey with us through the remaining lessons. The collapse of self-confidence is the birthplace of true faith. One of the most painful yet necessary moments in Peter's spiritual journey was the collapse of his self-confidence. This collapse did not happen quietly or privately. It happened publicly, emotionally, and in a way that left no room for excuses. This moment, more than any miracle he witnessed or sermon he heard, marked the turning point between shallow faith and enduring faith. True faith does not begin when confidence is high. It begins when confidence in self finally dies. Peter's greatest obstacle was never fear alone. It was misplaced trust. He trusted his courage, his loyalty, and his resolve. He believed that because he loved Jesus deeply, he would remain faithful under any circumstance. But love that has not been stripped of self-reliance is still fragile. When pressure came, Peter discovered that his strength was insufficient. This discovery was devastating, but it was also liberating. Self-confidence creates an illusion of control. It convinces the believer that faithfulness is a product of willpower. It frames obedience as something that can be maintained through discipline alone. Peter believed he could stand because he believed in himself. Fire revealed the truth. Faith sustained by self collapses the moment fear becomes overwhelming. The denial was not simply a moral failure, it was the exposure of a spiritual foundation built on human strength. When Peter denied Jesus, he was not rejecting Christ intellectually. He was choosing self-preservation instinctively. This revealed that his faith had not yet reached the depth where obedience outweighed survival. This collapse was essential because self-confidence competes with dependence on God. As long as Peter believed he could stand on his own, he would never fully rely on grace. God allows self-confidence to fail so that faith can be reborn in humility. What breaks us is often what finally prepares us to be used. The moment the rooster crowed and Peter realized what he had done, something irreversible happened inside him. Scripture tells us he wept bitterly. These were not tears of embarrassment alone, they were tears of recognition. He saw himself clearly for the first time. He saw the gap between intention and action, between desire and obedience. That clarity was painful, but it was holy. True faith begins when illusions die. When the image we have of ourselves is shattered, space is created for God to rebuild us properly. Peter's tears marked the end of performance-based faith. From that moment forward, he could no longer boast. He could only depend. This is why God does not prevent the collapse of self-confidence in his servants. Confidence in self is incompatible with spiritual authority. A man who believes he stands by his own strength will fall repeatedly. A man who knows he stands only by grace will cling to God with desperation and humility. After the resurrection, Jesus did not restore Peter by reaffirming his confidence. He restored him by questioning his love and reassigning him responsibility. "Do you love me?" was not a test of emotion. It was an invitation to surrender. Peter's answers were no longer bold declarations. They were humble acknowledgments. "Lord, you know." Self-confidence was gone. Dependence had replaced it. This transformation changed everything. Peter's preaching after Pentecost carried weight because it was no longer fueled by ego. His courage before persecution was real because it was rooted in grace, not bravado. He no longer trusted his resolve. He trusted God's power working through his weakness. This is why suffering believers later found comfort in Peter's words. He understood failure. He understood fear. He understood restoration. His faith had passed through collapse and emerged purified. He no longer spoke as someone untouched by struggle, but as someone transformed by it. True faith is not loud, it is steady. It does not boast. It endures. It does not rely on emotional highs. It survives spiritual winters. The collapse of self-confidence removes the need to appear strong and replaces it with the strength of surrender. Many believers resist this collapse because it feels like loss. But what feels like loss is actually gain. Losing confidence in self is the doorway to gaining confidence in God. Until that exchange happens, faith remains fragile. Peter's lesson is uncomfortable but essential. God will allow you to reach the end of yourself so that faith can finally begin. As long as you believe you can stand alone, you are standing on unstable ground. When self-confidence dies, faith becomes anchored in something unshakable. If you are walking through a season where your confidence has been shaken, do not despair. God may be dismantling what cannot sustain you, so he can build what will. This is not the end of your calling. It may be the beginning of your true faith. If this teaching is helping you understand why God allows moments of collapse and how true faith is formed through surrender, Subscribe to the channel now so you can continue with us into the next lesson. Faith refined by suffering becomes unmovable, not loud. There is a kind of faith that speaks loudly and collapses quickly, and there is a kind of faith that speaks softly and stands when everything else falls apart. Peter's journey teaches that suffering does not weaken genuine faith. It removes what is unstable so that what remains cannot be shaken. Faith refined by suffering does not seek attention, validation, or admiration. It becomes quiet, grounded, and deeply rooted in truth rather than emotion. Before suffering, Peter's faith was expressive and bold. He spoke quickly, acted impulsively, and often led with confidence rather than discernment. His devotion was visible, but it was also reactive. Suffering changed this. After the fire, Peter became steady. His words carried weight not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. He no longer needed to prove his faith. It had already been proven. Suffering strips faith of performance. It removes the need to appear strong. It silences the desire to be seen. When faith passes through pain, it learns that survival does not depend on recognition, but on endurance. This is why Peter later wrote to believers who were suffering, reminding them that trials were not strange or accidental, but purposeful. He understood that suffering was the furnace where faith becomes real. Faith, refined by suffering, stops negotiating with circumstances. It no longer asks God to remove every difficulty before obeying. It no longer waits for clarity before trusting. It obeys because obedience has become more valuable than comfort. Peter learned this through loss, rejection, and persecution. His faith no longer depended on favorable conditions. It remained firm even when obedience led to suffering. This kind of faith does not need constant reassurance. It has already faced fear and survived. It has already endured disappointment and remained loyal. It has already been misunderstood and continued forward. Suffering teaches faith to anchor itself in God's character rather than in outcomes. When faith knows God as faithful in pain, it is no longer shaken by uncertainty. Peter's later life was marked by opposition, imprisonment, and eventual martyrdom, yet there is no record of him retreating or denying Christ again. The man who once trembled before a servant girl stood unshaken before authorities. This transformation did not come from increased willpower. It came from faith refined through suffering. Refined faith understands limits. It no longer trusts enthusiasm. It does not confuse emotion with conviction. It does not promise what it cannot sustain. It commits quietly and endures patiently. Suffering teaches faith to count the cost and accept it fully. This is why refined faith does not boast. It knows what obedience requires. Suffering also deepens compassion. Peter's ability to strengthen others came from his own pain. He did not speak as an observer, but as a fellow sufferer. His encouragement carried authenticity because it was rooted in shared experience. Faith refined by suffering does not judge weakness harshly. It understands it. It restores rather than condemns. This kind of faith becomes resilient because it has learned that God's presence does not disappear in pain. It has experienced grace in moments of collapse. It has encountered God not only in victory but in loss. That experience cannot be erased by fear or hardship. Refined faith is not dramatic. It is durable. It does not require constant emotional stimulation. It remains faithful in silence. It prays even when answers are delayed. It trusts even when understanding is incomplete. Suffering teaches faith to remain without reward. Peter's teachings reflect this maturity. He spoke of rejoicing in suffering, not because pain was enjoyable, but because it produced something eternal. He knew that faith refined by fire resulted in glory, not shame. His confidence was no longer in himself, but in God's sustaining power. This is why refined faith does not panic when trials come. It recognizes them as familiar territory. It does not interpret suffering as abandonment. It sees it as refinement. It knows that what survives the fire will stand forever. If your faith feels quieter than it used to, less expressive but more grounded, it may be maturing. If you no longer speak boldly but trust deeply, it may be strengthening. Suffering has a way of removing noise and leaving truth behind. Faith refined by suffering does not seek escape. It seeks endurance. It does not look for shortcuts. It walks the narrow path faithfully. It does not need to be seen, it only needs to remain. Peter's life proves that faith forged in suffering becomes unmovable. It may not attract applause, but it will withstand storms. It will not impress crowds, but it will endure persecution. It will not boast in strength, but it will stand in truth. If this teaching is helping you understand how suffering refines faith and why endurance matters more than expression, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue with us into the final lesson of this series. Faith, proven in fire, becomes a witness. That comfort never could. There is a kind of faith that convinces the believer, and there is a kind of faith that convinces the world. The difference between the two is fire. Comfort may nurture belief internally, but it rarely produces a testimony that can withstand scrutiny, opposition, or persecution. Faith, proven in fire, however, becomes visible evidence of transformation. It becomes a living witness that cannot be explained away by circumstance, personality, or convenience. Peter's life after refinement was not marked by dramatic language or emotional displays. It was marked by consistency under pressure. His faith no longer needed validation because it had already been tested. This is what made his witness powerful. People were not persuaded by his words alone, but by the reality of a man who had faced fear, failure, and suffering, and yet remained faithful. Faith proven in fire carries authority because it has endured contradiction. It has survived disappointment. It has remained loyal when obedience produced loss rather than reward. This kind of faith does not rely on ideal conditions to function. It remains intact when misunderstood, rejected, or threatened. That endurance becomes its testimony. Before the fire, Peter's faith was mostly internal. It was real but immature. After the fire, his faith became external. It was visible in action, sacrifice, and perseverance. His courage was no longer theoretical, it was costly. And because it was costly, it was convincing. This is why persecution has always strengthened the church rather than destroyed it. Faith that survives pressure exposes the emptiness of superficial belief. It demonstrates that God is not followed merely for benefit but for truth. Peter understood this deeply. He encouraged believers not to be surprised by trials because he knew that suffering purified faith and amplified witness. Fire transforms faith into something that speaks even when the believer remains silent. Endurance itself becomes a message. A person who remains faithful in loss communicates something words cannot explain. Their life testifies that God is sufficient even when comfort is absent. This kind of witness cannot be fabricated. It cannot be imitated without experience. It emerges only when faith has been stripped of self-interest. Peter's authority did not come from position alone. It came from transformation. He was no longer the man who boasted and fell. He was the man who endured and stood. Faith proven in fire also produces peace that confounds observers. When others expect bitterness, resentment, or retreat, refined faith responds with steadiness. That steadiness becomes a question to those watching. How can someone remain faithful when circumstances provide no incentive? The answer is found only in genuine transformation. Peter's letters reveal this internal peace. He spoke of hope that could not be shaken, joy that existed in suffering, and confidence anchored beyond circumstances. This was not philosophy, it was lived reality. His faith had passed through fire and emerged purified. Fire also removes the fear of loss. When faith has already survived its worst fears, it no longer trembles at threats. Peter was no longer afraid of losing his life because he had already lost his illusions. He had already died to self-reliance. This freedom made his witness fearless. A faith that fears loss will compromise under pressure. A faith that has already surrendered everything becomes unstoppable. This is why refined faith is dangerous to systems built on fear. It cannot be controlled by intimidation or reward. It obeys a higher authority. Faith proven in fire becomes transferable. It strengthens others because it carries credibility. Peter could encourage suffering believers because he had walked the same path. His words were not theoretical encouragements but tested truths. This made his ministry sustainable and his influence enduring. This is the final lesson Peter teaches. Faith that survives fire becomes a testimony that comfort could never produce. It speaks without shouting. It persuades without force. It stands without boasting. It glorifies God not through success alone, but through endurance. If your faith has been tested, it is not wasted. If it has survived loss, it is not weakened. If it has endured fire, it has become something eternal. God uses refined faith not only to sustain you, but to reach others through you. Faith proven in fire becomes light in dark places. It becomes stability in chaos. It becomes evidence that God is faithful even when life is not easy. This is the faith Peter learned through failure, restoration, and endurance. And this is the faith that still transforms lives today. If this teaching has helped you understand the purpose of trials, the power of refined faith, and the depth of Peter's lesson, subscribe to the channel now so you can continue growing with us through future teachings.